Hi there, I'm Belinda Lee, and this is Step Into Me, the podcast about transformation and personal growth, embracing the quiet knowing deep in your heart, and finding the courage to step into your true self. On today's episode, we're going to meet Dave Dobson. Like so many people, Dave was living what seemed like the perfect life. He had a high-paying job working with the Foreign Office. He travelled the globe, had a wife, house, kids. Only for Dave, it felt like someone else's life. If Dave was to be true to himself, he would have to rewrite the rules.
I don't think anybody had really seen it coming. I had been incredibly good at masking what was happening on the inside.
If the life you're living is not the life for you, then Dave's journey from breakdown to breakthrough is a must listen. Today, we are venturing from overwhelm to authentic living. Picture this. You're standing in a crowded airport, suitcase in hand, passport at the ready. On the outside, your life looks perfect. You have a successful career, a big house in the country, family, kids, dogs. But inside, years of stress and conflicted feelings have reached boiling point, and you are about to have a very public meltdown. That is exactly what happened to today's guest. Dave built a life which ticked all of society's boxes. But the life he'd built, the roles he played, and the expectations he carried nearly broke him. Like so many, Dave learned to carry the weight in silence, imposing rules on himself, hiding his anxiety, and trying to keep everything together. But the cost of that facade was growing, and after years of bottling his feelings, he found himself at breaking point.
Looking back, I tend to think of it as episodic or chapters. And actually the biggest thing that was happening right then and kind of the end of that chapter was the unsustainableness of being able to continue being the breadwinner, being the person who was facilitating this lifestyle. And actually noticing that I was imposing a whole set of rules on myself around the anxiety and the stress I was feeling around work was something that I decided not to bring home. So there was a whole lot of carrying and not showing. And the end of that chapter was the unsustainableness of being able to do that. And I effectively broke down and then found myself rebuilding pretty much from scratch again.
Dave is a pansexual man, someone whose attraction to others isn't defined by gender. When he married, his sexuality was no secret. His wife understood that it was simply part of who he was. Theirs was a monogamous marriage, a relationship built on commitment and intention. And for many years, that was enough.
I think I had initially given myself the leeway of monogamy sequentially. And if you're looking at monogamy sequentially, there is an opening of the box. The box doesn't have a lid on. It's why I much prefer pansexual to bisexual. There's so much baggage attached with bisexual. And again, the standard assumption is that you need both at once. And I guess if we look at it from pansexual, which is my preferred wording, it's the acceptance that you are open to have a relationship based on attraction and not governed by gender. There can still be commitment to that, and it doesn't mean that you need everything all together all at once.
As time went on, the pressures of Dave's work grew heavier. And, as often happens, his marriage began to show signs of strain. Dave started seeking relief in ways that offered escape, even if only for the short term.
I guess the coping mechanisms, and people kind of think of the obvious ones of drink, drugs, and things like that as being the way people cope. But risky behaviour is also a coping mechanism. And I think there was risky behaviour around being monogamous. So losing myself in having short-term casual affairs was I guess, my drug of choice for not looking at what was actually happening towards the end of the marriage and being able to try and cope with the stresses of being within a job that was no longer sustainable and being able to carry on functioning as the standard family.
I think what you're saying there is just so relatable because many people find themselves stuck in exactly that space. I've been in that space where you're just going through the motions, finding ways to cope, whether that's drugs or alcohol or food, or as you say in your situation, risky behaviour. How did you break free from that cycle? What was the turning point for you?
I'm not sure that I broke free. I actually just broke. I had a probably stress induced, but a nervous breakdown. It was, I guess we could have seen the signs coming. At the time, it felt incredibly quick and incredibly brutal. I actually melted over a poor girl at a check-in desk at an airport in France when I'd just missed a connecting flight. And that shouldn't have been something that precipitated a full-blown mental breakdown, but it was just like the final stress straw that I just stopped functioning at that point.
And that's just so sad, isn't it? That sometimes that's what it takes to finally listen to that little voice.
Yep. And actually being then incredibly lucky in some ways that I was really well insured. I had access to the best possible care available. And within that care was the rebuilding of the self and a looking at the patterns which had existed in the past and just kept resulting in the same outcome of not being transparent about the stress I was under and using maladaptive coping mechanisms to try and get through it. So within the break and what came after it was that punctuation point to rebuild and to reassess and to actually start a new pattern and to have more understanding of the self in the embodiment of that pattern.
In the aftermath of Dave's breakdown, he began to rebuild and the landscape of his life began to change. He found new love. He discovered a new calling. And he started to shape a life that felt more honest and whole than ever before.
I am now in a loving relationship with a man. I actually have a dissonance about the word gay, and that dissonance is nothing to do with guilt or shame. It's just to do with the assumptions that people generally make when that label is used. And the assumption normally is that the marriage was a pretense, that there was a whole section of my life which wasn't me being my true self. I much prefer using queer because it gives me a lot more leeway. It's a description which has fewer hard edges to it. And I really dislike the implied disrespect to the mother of my children that goes along with a declaration of gay.
I love that you say that the marriage wasn't a pretense because it's true, people do often make that assumption. But your marriage was very real, and as you say, it was the stresses, particularly surrounding your work in the Foreign Office, that led to the breakdown and ultimately ended the marriage. But one of the things I love about you, Dave, is that when we were chatting before this interview, you said that you've never had a formal coming out, as it were, that you never felt the need for one. And I just love that you are now unapologetically you, that you can simply be you without having to explain your identity. How important is that to you?
I'm a little bit militant around around that side of it. Yeah, it's just the straight cis people do not come out as straight and cis. They just exist. And I think that embodied within this concept of coming out it's only implied, but it smells of needing to justify to me. And as soon as you need to justify, it then becomes something which is debatable and equivocable. And my sense of self isn't debatable or equivocable. So it just being a statement of fact, and I actually prefer to show rather than tell. So living an embodiment which shows my identity is my preferred way of being out.
And through it all, you became a psychotherapist of all things. Was that because of the help that you'd received?
It was. I can actually remember coming towards the end of the therapy, and the lady I was seeing actually, well, knowing what I know now, she definitely temporarily stepped out of the role slightly and said, I really think you should look at doing something within this profession. And the route she set me on was, have you ever thought of working for the Samaritans? And that actually was the first step towards what became a career in mental health.
In that role, what recurring themes have you seen of people struggling to live authentically?
I'm actually really privileged in that I get to do very long-term work with people. So I specialise in trauma with a capital T and with a small t, but trauma sits the same in both those instances. And I guess if we're simplifying it, because I'm dealing with trauma, something has happened to somebody. And to be able to cope with what's happened, we very creatively wrap layers of protection around the trauma that has happened. And the interesting thing is that the age at which the trauma happens is the agency you have and that you're using in building the protections you have. Those protections that are then incredibly single-minded, and they are sat on your shoulder the entire time, and they are on the lookout for you not getting hurt again. But what happens over time is that you grow, you have experience and more agency, and the protections ultimately become maladaptive in that they're protecting what was a much younger, less resilient version of you. And rather than the trauma itself being the ongoing issue, which it still will be in some respects, but the protections that you've built to initially cope with the trauma are the things which are holding you back. And it's, to really simplify it, my job is just repunctuating. And all we're doing is putting a full stop after the trauma. This happened, this is part of your narrative, we're not making this go away, but there is a full stop after it now. And we can look over our shoulder and see it in the rearview mirror, but it's no longer sat actually on your shoulder and doing the driving anymore.
Do you find it easy now to recognise when that little voice inside is speaking to you?
Within psychotherapy, there's a term called blending, which is normally we just move through life and we think that we're driving. But there's times when we blend into a younger version of ourselves, behave with the agency of that younger version of ourselves, then blend back out. And you can normally tell it's happened because you look over your shoulder and you go, oh, why didn't I just? And there's a whole set of things you could have done, but you just didn't for some reason. And it's because they weren't in the room at the same time, because you'd blended into this version of yourself, which is probably trauma linked. I'll give you an example. I haven't had the easiest relationship with my dad, and I took a previous partner. We went to see my dad, and I thought at the end of it, whoa, I came through that okay. And as we were walking out, he said, it was really interesting meeting the 14-year-old you. I'm not quite sure I like them. But and I had, when I looked back, yes, I had spent the entire afternoon as a stroppy teenager who was basically going, oh, no. And just not being the adult in the room. And that was a major example of it, but that those things happen on a small scale as well in everyday life. And actually starting to be curious about why they're happening and to just gently pull myself back into being the adult with agency.
And why do we do that? I've had that exact conversation with a girlfriend. Why do we, when we step into our parents' house, become that 15-year-old self again and then feel angry with ourselves when we leave? I mean, how do we break free from that?
Yeah, it is exactly that. And I think mine was to do with safety. That the 15-year-old self was just holding the idea that this is not a safe place to be transparent. So the moody teenager angst of, you're going to get monosyllables off me and I'm not going to tell you anything and I'm just going to tut a lot and roll my eyes at you, was the agency a 15-year-old probably had to keep distance there. And it's starting to realise that, do you know what? I've got a much better toolbox at being able to be appropriately transparent now. And I don't have to rely on those incredibly blunt tools for managing my relationship with him.
I think that's so interesting that you didn't feel it was a safe place to be transparent, that part of you who knew who you were and felt that you had to keep a distance. I think that's just so interesting. So how do you know when you're tapping into your authentic self?
I think the first steps are listening, and it seems slightly negative, but if you start to listen, you kind of get the tone of your internal dialogue, and that can actually be incredibly surprising to some people. You are actually fully in charge of the tone you use to yourself, but lots of us choose to use a tone which has been inherited from somebody else. And I use it occasionally. It's a bit of a sneaky question, but sometimes it feels right to ask, ooh, whose voice is that? And it can be an insight, but it also gives that space to start realizing, actually, this isn't the authentic voice. This isn't how, if I was nurturing a younger version of me, if I was one of my own children, this is not the tone I would be using with them. So why am I continuing to use it on myself? So it's starting to notice the actual tone of your internal voice and what judgments come tied up with that as well. And gently reparenting in some ways, that you get to choose the parent you want to be for yourself.
I love that, because I often refer to that little voice, that truth, if you will, as the child within, and the conscious voice as the adult voice.
Yes, there's absolutely acknowledging the child. And actually, the counterintuitive thing is, it probably works more with the teenager thing, that the instinct is to try and shout that part of you down and to say, stop being silly, stop doing that. But actually, counterintuitively, that just hardens that part of you that's going, yeah, even you don't understand me. I need to stay here and do this for you to be safe. You need to acknowledge those different parts of you, to sit alongside them and to gently ask what they're afraid of, and for them to start to know the adult you, and for them to let go of the protections that they've had to put in place to feel safe, and trust and believe that the adult you has a whole toolbox of protections that will make them safe, and they will not need to reenact the protections that they'd used earlier. So it's not just in acknowledging the child within, it's in compassionately understanding, accepting, and asking, can you take over? Can I look after what you're afraid of?
It's also courageous to listen to and act on that little voice within. And you actually did that. I mean, how does it feel now to be unapologetically you?
I think it's still a work in progress. And actually I like it being a work in progress, because the you is evolving, and within that evolving is also a discovery of, if we're taking the theme of rewriting the rules, that there are other rules which have been inculcated, which it's only as I'm continuing and as I'm growing that you start to realise that, ooh, that's there. I wonder why that's there and what's it doing? And it's that ongoing nature of it, which it might sound like I've just subjected people to a lifetime of ongoing continuous improvement, but I actually think there's something exciting within it not being a definite end that you will do this is nirvana, you then sit in nirvana.
So if you could speak to your younger self, perhaps that version of you just entering the Foreign Office or just starting your marriage, what would you say?
I think there was a lot of automatically carrying some rule sets with me. I just realised we're in the middle of the New Romantics. I had bleach blonde hair and a face full of slap. So there were definitely some rules which I wasn't carrying, and actually just taking that further and being okay and listening to the self and having that internal sense of validation. Whereas actually looking back at it now, there was a very strong need for an external source of validation.
So what does meaning and purpose look like for you now?
Ooh, I think it's kind of got to a place where I like to think of myself as 360 degrees so that it allows for nuance. So if I think of myself as a circle, no one thing or no one person can give meaning to that entire circumference. And no one thing will give purpose to that entire circumference. So it's around acknowledging there is an entirety where a patchwork of different meanings and different purposes will actually touch each part of that circle, and that you can be creative in building a life wherever I can. I try to ensure that that 360 degrees is being sustained. And I guess that also goes back to the sense of rewriting the rules, where the established rule is there will be the one who will be the everything and will touch all of your circle, and you don't need anything from anybody else.
I love the visual of that no one person or thing can give meaning to that entire circumference. It's just such a lovely way of being, a lovely way of looking at the world. I love it. Dave, for the person listening to this podcast who sees themselves in your story, who's where you were all those years ago, what would you like them to know?
I guess partly that change is possible. Change absolutely is possible, and that change usually starts by acknowledging dissonance, that we need to have some sense that something's off. So if this conversation just allows people to accept the dissonant sound that's there and to go, ooh, why is that dissonant? And for it to be okay, for that not to be a judgment of I'm failing here, I'm doing something wrong, but to be able to just go, okay, let me hold this feeling. Let me try and hold it without judgment, and let me hold it long enough to try and understand what this is saying about me, what is this saying about the situation. And that from that understanding that the dissonance isn't a fault line that you need to stamp on to make it go away. The dissonance is often a little smoke alarm going off, and being curious about where that fire might be coming from is probably a really good start.
Dave, thank you so much for sharing your story with such honesty and generosity today, and for the insights that you've shared, not only from your personal journey, but from your professional experience as well. It's been wonderful. Thank you for showing us what it means to step into your truth, and for the important work that you do as well, helping others do the same.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Dave as much as I did. His is quite a story. Not only has he experienced a complete breakdown and worked through it, But he's also found a new purpose, drawing on that painful experience to help others navigate their trauma. And as Dave said, if you are where he was all those years ago, just know that change is possible. And it often begins with recognizing that something inside just doesn't feel right. I think one of the other great things that I certainly learned from speaking with Dave is the whole concept of blending, which is not something I'd heard of before. And just that idea that we often blend our teenage or younger coping mechanisms with adult challenges. So I guess that's something we can work on this week if we find ourselves reacting in a way that feels old or familiar, withdrawing, people-pleasing, lashing out. We can pause and ask ourselves, who is speaking or acting out right now? And just gently check in with that younger part of ourselves and thank them for trying to keep us safe, but also reminding ourselves that we're adults now and we can choose a new way. And then just notice what changes when we bring our adult self back into the moment. I think it's a great lesson, and thank you, Dave, for sharing that with us. And thank you too for joining us for episode 2 of Step Into Me. If you'd like to share your journey or your thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. Send your comments to mail@stepintomepodcast.com or leave a comment or review on your favourite podcast platform. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Step Into Me and leave a 5-star review so you don't miss what's coming next. And speaking of what's coming next, the next episode we are going to look at drama. And I'm not talking about the works of Shakespeare, but the drama that is sometimes of our own making, and how letting go of drama can not only help you reclaim some energy, but it can also help you live authentically. And that's what this podcast is all about. I'm Belinda Lee. This is Step Into Me, helping you find the courage to be true to you.